Great. Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited for this class. I'm here on behalf of Silver Creek Leather, and they really want you to know that there is so much that you can do with leather products, leather cording, and different things, and you don't have to be either independently wealthy to afford them or have had decades of experience to use them to make something that is going to look really, really nice. Um, Today, what I'm going to be showing you is how to make a couple different patterns of bracelets that are kind of geared toward more of a masculine look. Of course, it doesn't have to be for a guy. It can be for anyone who, likes something that's a little more of this rustic, sort of simple style. And these are the three general designs we're going to be doing, but I will also be showing you some variations on these designs that you can do just to make sure you can see how different they can look with the exact same steps, the same pattern, but just a substitution of a different colored cord added in, a different kind of bead, those kind of small changes that you won't have to think about it very hard, but it'll look like you made a completely different bracelet. Um, I think leather is really a wonderful material for, well, for a lot of things. I'm a leather worker, so of course I like it, but it's really great for bracelets because it's sturdy. It's got a really classic look, and I think even someone in your life who might not normally be a jewelry wearer, might be a little hard to gift for, maybe more open to something that has this kind of classy, just leather look. It's going to look like you'd spent so much time and money on these, without having to actually necessarily do either, which when you're a crafty person, as I am too, that can be important sometimes because you can end up spending a lot of both of those on your crafts, and especially when making gifts, it's important that you actually have time to make what you want to make. So I'm going to switch over to the camera so you can see my hands. Swing this over here, get it evened out so that the grid's not going to drive anyone insane. Make sure my focus looks okay. And actually, I'm going to fix that focus for just a second. There we go. All right. So here are our three main bracelets. All of these are made completely of things that you can get at Michael's, of course, and that you should be able to find in store. They are utilizing some different elements to try to get some different looks. We've got some braided, it's called Bolo cord, which is really cool because it makes it look like you did a lot more work than you actually did because it comes pre-braided. And some wooden beads, some thinner round cording, and also some jump rings to give it a little more of a sort of industrial look. So you can just try a few different things. So I'm going to start with this one because it's kind of the most simple in terms of sort of how many elements are in it. And this bracelet is made of 3 strands of this braided bolo cord. It's got one in the middle of a 5 millimeter round bolo cord, and this is black, but of course you could do it in any color. They've got others. And then we've got on either side a single strand of 3 millimeter. You could absolutely do this with 3 strands of the same thickness. But I kind of like how it just gives it a little bit of a different look. And then to create these knots that are attaching the strands together, we'll be using a thinner leather cording, which is 1 millimeter. And we'll be using that to get into the knots. And then for all of these bracelets, we'll be using these glue-on clasps. And I will obviously be showing you how to put those in. There are a lot of different clasp options for this kind of work. Of these, often they're called cord end clasps, where they have the space inside to sort of glue the end of the cording into it. I mean, I must have found, 5, 6 totally different ones. And I picked these for these particular bracelets because they ended up being the right size for kind of how many, layers of cording I had in these. But there are so many others. And as long as the end of your bracelet fits well in there, it fits firmly, but not, you can get it in there, but you don't want it to be so loose that it's jiggling around, because then the glue is going to have to do a lot more work. So basically any clasp that the end of it will fit into well, will work equally well with these. Before I start though, the first thing when you're going to make a bracelet, especially as a gift for a specific person, is you need to know how long is it going to be. And there are average lengths that you tend to see in bracelets. If you look it up, where it's a lot of times 7 inches maybe is around average for, they say, for women's wrists, or 8 inches for men's. But the best thing, of course, is to measure if you're able to. And if you really want it to be a surprise and you don't want to measure the recipient's wrist, if you can get a hold of a bracelet or even a watch that they like, it can help. But if you are measuring, I mean, some of this you may just be able to figure out on your own, but I did want to point it out, just because there's nothing worse than spending the time to make the bracelet and then you realize, oh, that was not the right measurement. But what you want to do is in a perfect world, you have the cooperation of the person, and they can either give you a bracelet that they like the fit of, or they can say, I like my bracelets with, so and so, this much give, because some people like them very tight, some people like them looser. The main thing is you do want to make sure that even if they like a looser bracelet, you do want to make sure it's not going to be able to slip over their hand. And most people find it more comfortable if it does not go too far down their hand. And you, of course, don't want to make it too tight, because it won't be comfortable, and it could also end up, potentially, popping off, or getting, you're putting more pressure on the clasp if it's kind of tight as the person moves their wrist and everything. So you really want to think not about a wrist measurement, but about how do I feel about this if this is a bracelet? For me, I'm making these to my husband's wrist measurement, because he loves bracelets. And he would probably wear every single one of these at the same time if he could. But so what I came up with his was, he likes about 8.5 inches, which I think is probably fairly average length for a man's bracelet. And the last thing that you really need to keep in mind when you're deciding on the length of these is the length that the clasp adds to it, because it's easy to forget, but it does add a little bit. So you don't want to be surprised later. These particular clasps, the best way to figure it out is, I figured out that the space inside, the ends of the cords go in about a 1/4 inch on each end. So we're going to have to remove that measurement from, the whole measurement of the clasp. So if I measure the clasp, it's about 1.25 inches. And then I know that I'm going to lose a 1/2 inch, because it's a 1/4 inch on each end, that the leather's going in there. So I'm going to lose it from my total measurement of like what I'm measuring for the leather pieces when I trim them. So I know then that with this clasp together, which is the best way to measure it, it's going to add about 3/4 of an inch. So I just consider that. So I'm, as I'm doing this, I'm aiming for the actual leather part of this to end up being, at about 7 3/4 inch. So, 8, my measurement minus what this is going to add. But it's always better to start with your pieces longer, because you can trim them. So to actually get going on this guy, I'm moving stuff to the side. What you'll need here is 1 length of the 5mm Bolo cord, and 2 lengths of the 3mm. And I've cut them at 9 inches, because that just gives me a little bit of extra on either end to trim off at the end. It's a lot better if you end up long than short. So it's I found that for the measurement I'm going for, 9 inches is about right. I'm also using this black 1 millimeter cording. It comes on its own, but also it comes in a card with these 3 colors, which is really handy because we're actually going to be using 2 different colors of it for 2 of these bracelets. So I'm using the black, and I cut about a 24-inch length. It may be probably longer than I need for this exact thing, but it is always better to have a bit of extra, because if you come up short, it's kind of frustrating. I also need for this a stitching needle. It doesn't need to be a sharp needle. It can be, more of a leather needle that has this kind of blunted end. Although if it is a pointy needle, it's fine. The main thing is that you need one that has a big enough eye to put this cording in. So, like a standard sewing needle is not probably going to do it unless it's quite large. You might find that even with a large eye needle, you can't get this in because it's just round. If you've got pliers, you can squish the end of the cord and flatten it to get it started. And then it's a lot easier to get in, because once you get it started, you can pull it through the eye really easily. So with this bracelet, what I did is I did 3 knots. You could clearly do more. But it's got 3 knots, and the first one, I'm just going to start by centering this one because that's the easiest way to go out from there. So since the knot starts in the centerpiece, what I need to do is find the center of my thicker bolo. And you could clearly use a ruler for this, but my ruler is really shiny, so it's a little bit easier to use this on screen because I can actually see it. So I just want to get about that 4.5 measurement around the middle. But again, if you don't end up exactly in the middle, you've got a little bit of extra around the sides. So you don't have to worry too much. This cord it's a round braid, it's braided together from multiple pieces or multiple strands. And what I need to do is basically just decide, any of these spots where the braids come together, I need to get this needle in and stick it through. It can go through the center, but it's all right if it only goes through one loop, which is a little bit easier. But what I need to do is I need to get it through there to anchor this knot. At first, it can feel a little awkward because you're trying to sort of work the needle under the loops of this cording, although we only have to do it once per knot on this one. But I will promise that since I've done a bunch of this recently, you do get a feel for sort of how to get the needle in there and how hard you need to push and everything fairly quickly. So if you're feeling frustrated at the beginning, I'm with you, and but it does get quite a bit easier. You do need to be a little bit careful not to kind of yank on these loops here. Like I wouldn't want to be really pulling up on my needle, because while this is very durable cord, if you yanked hard enough sharply, you could potentially like break one of these loops, which is a little bit frustrating. You may find you need your trusty pliers back for this, just to pull this through, or at least it does make it a little bit easier. So I've got that under one loop, which is fine. If you end up kind of getting it through the middle of the cord, that also works. We just want to do this so that the end of it is coming essentially from the bottom to the top of what I'm working with here. And the bolo cord it does have a pretty notable curve on it when you cut it off of the roll that it comes on. With this bracelet, it doesn't matter. You just kind of allow that curve to be there, and it's going to be a bracelet, so it's fine. But if you do need to flatten it out, you can sort of start curving it the opposite way and just work it with your fingers a little bit, and it will flatten out. It just needs the different layers that are braided together just have to sort of shift a little bit. So I've got this through here, and actually I just realized that because of the way this is curved, it would actually be better if, as I said, I went from the bottom up, because I want this tail to be sticking out on the back side. So I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch the ends that I have my needle on. if I hadn't done that, it wouldn't matter. I could just loop it around one more time, but all right. So I want to leave a tail of maybe a couple of inches, just enough so I can hold it in there. And then I want to lay these pieces, these thinner cords, one on each side, and I can just hold it in place. Once you get the first knot in, it's a little easier because they don't shift. Fortunately, because these are very stiff, they tend to stay in place really well. So I'm just going to hold it like this, and I'm kind of holding on to the little tail. And I've got my thinner cord is coming up kind of through the middle about of here, of this thicker bolo in the center. So what I want to do first is just loop. I'm going to go kind of, I'm going to go under and then back up over this around my center cord. I could have done that before I put these side ones on, but just because I want to make sure that it wraps around it fully, the first time. Sometimes your little tail will want to become part of what you're doing, which is why it's a little bit easier to hold it under there. So I've gone around once, so I'm coming up over the side of this center. So now you could do this without a needle once you've got it through here, but I think it's a little bit easier with the needle. So now I'm coming up from here, coming around, and I'm basically just going to weave this through. So I'm going to go down under the thinner bolo, and then I'm going to make sure this isn't wound around anything, which it always seems to be on that first go. All right, so I went down, and I'm going to go back up, and then under my middle piece, back up, and around my second side bolo. And then you can do this all going, see, I sort of did it, and I'm kind of skewing off to the side here. You can do it all one direction, or a lot of times I will do it so that when this overlaps, my first one, say, goes to one side, and then as I come down here, I'm gonna start going to the other side, just so that middle loop kind of ends up in the middle. But it doesn't matter if it ends up on the side. So now I'm going to go around the side one, up, over the middle, around this side one, and over, and then down under the middle, and just keep weaving it around like that. And at first it's kind of hard to see what it's doing because it'll be fairly loose and kind of spaced out. Once you get it around there a couple times, and I know this is a bit hard to see on camera because it's all black, but once you get around there a couple times, it's a lot easier to hold in place. So now I've just gone, I've kind of woven through this way and then back this way. I'm going to go under so that I'm looping up around the side piece, over the middle, down again. And just think of it, oops, my thing got looped. It's just weaving. You're just weaving. So, if the last one went under, then this one needs to go over. And if you just did something strange like I did and it gets looped together in a weird way, then you undo it and you keep going. All right, now I'm actually doing it right. So over the center and then down in there. And you can do this as many times as you want. It depends how many loops you want on your knot. I'm kind of aiming for having 3 on the sides. So this will be my third one. I've got one, oops, sorry. I'm on camera. I've got 1, 2. So I'm going to go over this, under, pull it through. And then I've got 1, 2 on this side. So I'm going to go under and then over one more time. Now, if I look, I've got, let's see. Yeah, I've got 3 loops in the middle, 3 here, and 3 here. So it's okay that they're a little bit loose. They don't cluster all together kind of naturally, but that's fine because I am now going to loop around the spaces between these cords so that it sort of gathers them together. So you can see on this one in particular, you can see, so I've done this part, and now I'm just going to do these little loops right here. So I have come up right here between this side and the middle. And now I want to go around the layer, the cords that are between these larger ones. So I want to go up and under here and then around that. So I'm kind of bundling those little spots together. I went up once and go around again. You could do this, I mean, you could do it one time. I like to do it, make sure I do it at least two because it's a little bit more secure. It does mean that the more times you do this, depending on how loose or tight your you did any of the cord wrapping, you may find that it makes a larger or smaller space between the cording. So if you're trying for that effect, you know, this is one way to get it, would be to wrap it much looser and then you come around. So now that I've gotten a couple loops on there, I'm going to cross diagonally. So I'm coming down right here. So I want to come up over here. So I'm going diagonally across and then I'm going to go around. Make sure my loop's not getting away from me. There we go. And then go around one more time. And I guess I left kind of 3 on the other side, so I might as well do it the same on this side. And then I have this little bundle right here. So I've gotten all 3 of these attached, and then I've tightly wound these around the middle so it sort of pulls everything together and it looks a lot neater. Once you've got that on there, you need to turn over your bracelet and you'll see something, I'm trying to angle it, there we go. You'll see something kind of like this. It'll be much like the front, except you're going to have at least one piece of the cording slanting across the center because that's where you went across for the last step. And then you should have, oh, there it is. You should have your tail sticking out, depending on where it kind of ended up with your weaving, if it got caught up in it, which I think mine actually did. Mine's kind of sticking out the top up here. It may be kind of coming out underneath the center portion, which is also fine. As long as it's gotten overlapped with something at least once, it'll be just fine. So now I'm coming up on, you know, this side right here. So I want to use the needle to run it under all this cording right here in the center. And this is another spot where you may need pliers just to gently pull it through because everything is probably going to be fairly tight at this point. Run that under, pull it snug, and then I can clip this off. You can use scissors. This is very easy to cut. Scissors, a blade, or jewelry snips or whatever. So right now I've got this knot. Everything's very secure. And I have 2 ends coming out, but I don't want to do anything with them yet because that's something that I'll want to deal with right at the end. And if on mine, I had 3 knots that I made, and I've got this one right here where I already did 2. So what I did on my second one is it just depends how many you want. So I decided, you know, if I'm looking at a 8.5-inch bracelet, I just decided I wanted them, you know, I thought this spacing looked good. It would mostly be seen at the top. None of them are really close to the clasps. So I decided on about, you know, 1.5 inches apart. So just to show you one more time, because I know this one is hard to see, I want to kind of gauge, where's my 1.5 inches apart? Right there. So again, I'm going to flip this over. I need to push the needle through from the bottom to the top, at least through one of these loops in the bolo. And sometimes you have to really wiggle it and get it through. But again, I promise you, it gets much easier when you get kind of a little feel for how the cord is working. So I've got my couple inches of a tail there. I'm holding it with my finger. This is coming out about on the top of the cord. If it's coming out a little bit on the side, it's fine. but I'm just gonna wind this around one time just to make sure I've got sort of a full, the cord's going all the way around it, so you don't really see where it's coming up like that. Then I'm gonna go up and over, under, and then up and over this, under my middle piece, over this side. And if I hold that in place, I can swing around. It's at the beginning that it feels a bit awkward because everything's kind of loosey goosey and it's trying to move around. But once you get even just one go around, it everything kind of stays in place a little bit better. So I'm going over the middle, and then again I'm going to go in, under the middle, and over the sides. Just remember you're weaving, so you just as long as you're alternating your over under, you will be just fine. And I'm going to go around one more time. So under, over. Make sure everything's on there where I want it to be. And actually, if I want 3 loops, I'm going to go one more time over that. The tail from my other one's trying to get involved with this. All right, so over, under. And then again, I have this, it looks a little messy at this point because everything's it's kind of spaced out. But if I just tuck these together a bit, make sure they're not too loose. And then I have this bit of cord, it's coming up right here. I'm gonna go over and around. Kind of tug that firm. With this thin leather cording in particular, it is quite strong for what it's made of, but it isn't a woven cord. It's a single material. So you do really need to make sure that you don't jerk on it really sharply, because if you do that, it's much more likely to break. But you can, tug on it gently. So I just went around one other time. I'm gonna do a slantwise cross across here, go around. And there it is. And then just like the last time, I'm gonna run my needle through this under. I'm trying for all of the middle loops, but if for some reason you don't get through all of them, it's okay. You just want to get under most of them to secure that end. Once you've got that, you're almost done. In some ways, I thought when I put this class in this order that this would be the easiest one, but now I'm realizing that in some ways it's the hardest. So I should have put it last. So sorry about that, guys. Once you have that, what you're gonna want is some glue. I like to use this super glue gel, and just put a tiny little dot of it in the places where both of these cords are coming out. You don't need to do too much. It's just to secure that end so it's not going to shift. And once you've done that and that's dried, you can clip off the cords kind of right where they emerge from where they've gone under these other loops. And then you won't have any messy cording sticking out. And we'll assume I did the other ones the same way, but so it actually does have a very neat look once it's all finished, and it does stay quite securely on there. When it comes to the clasp, I'm going to show them all at the end, or I'll show you at the end after the last one doing that clasp. But with all the bracelets, you need to make sure that your ends are even, and then figure out exactly what your length is if you need to trim off any excess. And then with this clasp, what I can do is make sure, does it fit? It's a little bit hard to get this middle round cord in there, but just like I did with the one for the needle, I can squish it a little bit with pliers right on the end. And generally, once you do that, you'll be able to slide it over. What you're looking for is a firm fit, so it's not just falling off. But then you want to put the super glue inside there and then insert this in. And I'll actually show that with the last with the last bracelet because they are all using the same clasp. But here is another variation on the same bracelet that's just using different color cord, and everything's kind of the same, but you can see how different you can make them look with very little actual changes. And you could put like a little bead there, or you put more knots, or a bunch of them clustered together. There's just endless possibilities. So moving on to the next bracelet. The next one is this.
Hey, Annie.
For guy, yeah.
There's a quick question in the chat. Just kind of going back to the previous bracelet. How much should we consider for stretch in that bolo cord? Does it really stretch a lot, or is it pretty forgiving?
I have not found that it stretches much at all. I haven't done like pressure tests on it. I mean, I think if it got wet, it could potentially stretch a bit more. But because it's braided from multiple pieces, you're definitely not going to get as much stretch as you might with a single piece of leather cording. So I haven't found that, at least under normal conditions. I've not noticed it stretching very much at all.
Perfect. Thank you.
But you definitely want to make sure the person doesn't shower in it. When leather gets wet, that's when things start to get a little complicated with it stretching out. So for this one, what we're using is just 3mm, I believe, or is it? Oh, 2mm. Okay. This is, I believe it's 2mm leather cord. It is a bit thicker, obviously, than the thinner stuff that we were using. I was using on the last one. So for this, what you're going to want to do is cut 3 lengths of I cut about 24 inches, and I know I'm going to have a bunch left at the end, but past experiences, I don't want to end up short. So you could probably get away with cutting maybe more like 20. It really does depend on what your what length of bracelet you're working with, but you really do want to make sure you have extra. So I've got 3 24-inch lengths here. I'm going to make sure they're all evened up together, because what I want to do with these are double them, because the bracelet's actually made of 3 kind of groups of 2. So I'm doubling it down the middle here. And then if you have something, you can loop this around. You don't really need to exert a lot of pressure on it, as you might if you're like braiding a bracelet or something. But it's easier to have something kind of hold these in place. And actually, one thing I find works is the binder clip thing like this, if you don't have something to loop it around. And I'll be trimming these at the end, but it just kind of keeps everything in the same spot. And you could even, tape this down or something, but I tried that and I didn't find it actually helped that much. So I've got kind of the way it loops up. I sort of have my 3 groups of 3, and I want to separate them into, or it sort of goes into 2 groups of 3, and I want to separate it into 3 groups of 2 here, just as if I was going to braid it. So I've got these 15mm jump rings. They were basically, I was trying to find the biggest, thickest jump ring I could find, so it kind of looks a little bit more like a, like real hardware, like an O-ring. So how to start this is you want to take your center 2 pieces and slide the jump ring on. And at this point, you really just need to decide which way, as you are putting this on, you want to orient the ring. It doesn't matter, because flipping the bracelet, it would look, it doesn't change the look of it, but just for the purpose of you doing this. So you need to decide basically whether it's like this with the cord going in there sort of top to bottom, or whether you want it like this with the cord kind of going in there from, I guess back to front. And you just need to do it the same so that, your sort of weaving doesn't get confused. So I'm going to do it like this. So I'm going in, I need to remember my center is going in front to back, sort of from the top. So I'm going to hold these 2 together a little bit out of the way. So this is another one that's, it's basically, it's not really braiding, it's more weaving. So I'm going to take my two on the side, doesn't matter which side. And because this is going in front to back, I want these two to go in back to front. And I can pull them through and make sure they're not twisted. And then do that on this side. So again, back to front. And as you're doing this one, if at any point you suddenly can look down and you're confused because you feel like something's flipped, it's just because when you put on the ring first, if it flips, while you're not looking at it, suddenly you'll be like, wait, my back to front became a front to back. And it can seem a little confusing at first, but if you just make sure that they're all oriented the same, it'll really help. And essentially, you just keep doing this. So I've got my center one. I'm going to go through my ring, slide it up there. And I want to make sure it's oriented again so that it is going in like the one above it. So front to back there, flipped it over. And then again, I'm just putting these through the opposite way. Sometimes you have to sort of push it over to make room to get these in there. Here we go. And then as you start adding these on, you can kind of adjust the tension of it, and just gently push up the jump rings. There comes a point where they just won't get any closer together, which is about here, which just depends on it's just the kind of run up against the thickness of the leather. But you could also have them spaced further apart. It does take a bit of pressure to move them, so I think they'd probably stay in place if it was further apart, but I just sort of pushed mine up until they were kind of firmly against the one above. You may even find that it's easier to do this kind of working away from you, potentially, just depending on what hands you're using for things and how you do this. I'm left-handed, so if you're not, you maybe find yourself doing this a little bit differently. But if you feel it's awkward, it's definitely worth kind of flipping it, seeing if that's better. But then you can just gently tug that one up there. And you just keep going like that. See, I knew I should have started with this one. This one's a lot easier. But I do think it has a cool look. It's very flexible. It's very flat on the back, be comfortable to wear. But just to show you how to finish it, I've got one right here. You can see I have my loop there. I'm gonna replace this on here. At this point, it's not going anywhere, but just for safety's sake. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It helps if you measure, as you're going, like after you have a few on there, so that you can figure out how many do I need, like say how many is two of them. It's like measuring a knitting gauge. How many is two of the rings or three of them, wherever you get an even measurement, and then you can go from there to figure out how many you think you need, until you get to the end of your bracelet. So I'm just going to add a couple more, because my first bracelet that I made that ended up the right size, I ended up using 9 of them. Although keep in mind with this one that because they can sort of slide and be a little bit further from each other if you don't really tug them all up so that they're nice and snug. Don't go just by the number of rings for your measurement, because it may end up being looser than you mean. Also go by the the actual measurement, like keep checking that. And I just did something weird. What did I do? This one slid really far. Oh, see, I accidentally did this one backwards. So it was going down through, which actually you could do, I suppose, if you alternated them. That is sort of the one challenge of this bracelet. I think in some ways it's very forgiving, but sometimes things end up kind of flipping. And suddenly you realize, wait a minute, why does that look almost right, but not quite? So I'm always looking at the one kind of above where I have it, so that I can see that I'm matching up the orientation. Because if you think about it too hard, it just gets more confusing. All right, I'm gonna slide this guy on here. And you keep doing this until you've got the length that you want. You do want to keep in mind that you we'll need a little bit of extra length at the top and bottom for the clasp. You don't want to have the ring all the way, up against the clasp, because it's going to push the cords apart, and it may make it a lot harder to get it into there. So this is the same kind of clasp. So at the end, on your looped end here, the other end will already just be loose, and you'll want to trim it. But on your looped end here, you'll need to cut your loops. And then I found it actually easiest to even out the ends of this with instead of with scissors, with an X-Acto, just because you can lay it across there and it doesn't end up, sometimes they shift when you're cutting them with scissors, and then they just don't end up very even. There you go. And then if you kind of cluster them together, these ones fit pretty easily. Move them a little bit. They slide pretty easily in there. And I found that if I leave above the edge of the ring, the most, first and last of the rings, if I leave about, I ended up leaving about 3/4 of an inch. It was from here to here, it was about the right amount to give it enough give, I guess, to get that clasp on. You could probably do a 1/2 an inch maybe. You just don't want this to be too jammed up against the clasp, because it could be pulling against the cord, and we want everything to be nice and secure. You'll also see that depending on which way you do this, they look pretty much the same, but it's basically opposite. I mean, so this is going over, under, over, under, over, under, and on the other side, it's going under, over, under, over, but it's essentially the same on both sides. My variation I did on this one was I ended up using a different clasp, which you can also get at Michael's, because this cording was a little bit thinner, or I didn't use as many layers. But what I decided to try it with a few different colors, and I'm using the same kind of jump rings, but these ones are just a touch smaller. I think they're 12 millimeter instead of 15. But because they're a little bit smaller, instead of using 3 sort of groups of 2 strands, I was using one group of 2 in the middle, and then a single strand on the sides, and then I used 2 different colors. But you can see how you can definitely get some, fair amount of variation in the look of it, depending on how you do the colors, the proportions of everything. And then you absolutely could do you could add something in here. You could have a little bead right here. You could add other elements as you go.
Hey, Annie, we have a question about the orientation of the clasp and how they fit together on this one.
Oh, this one, yes. This clasp is it's a cool clasp, but that one little piece really wants to get away. It's these 2 ends that each have a sort of 2-part clasp. So I have two cord ends in each, because I only used 4 cords on this one. And I did find that I had to use an X-Acto to kind of make the ends of this cord slightly pointy to get it in there easily. So you just kind of slice the end off just a little bit, just to make it easier to insert. It made my life easier. This one, the way it's oriented, they're the same. There's no the orientation doesn't matter until this part is on here. So with this particular clasp, it doesn't matter as much, because they're symmetrical this way. But this center part loops around one of them, and then it ends up grabbing onto this second one. It may be probably user error. I keep having this middle part fall off as I'm trying to use it. But it is a cool clasp. Once it's on there, it's really on there. With these ones that I'm using kind of for all of the main bracelets, you just need to make sure that the top orientation is the one where they're curved down. So I know that this is the top of this one because it's curving downwards, and this is the top of this one because it's curving downwards, and they fit together like that. And then if they're curving up, that's the bottom that you're seeing. But it is important to check that before you commit to gluing because the worst thing would be to, firmly glue it in and realize you've got, one side correct and one side flipped, because they're not going to fit together very well at that point. It just doesn't work. So I'm going to move that to the side. In some ways, I think this one's my favorite because I think there's a lot of different things you can do with it. I did some experimenting with, crossing, trying to, like, what if I did sort of little X's with the cord and sort of crossed them over each other as I did this. And there were a lot of, slightly different ways to do it. And there's something really satisfying about kind of sliding these rings up on here, and they're held so firmly in there. Push that one off to the side. And our last bracelet, and then as soon as I finish this one, I'll show you actually attaching the clasps on all of them, because it's pretty much the same. This one's using that same 5mm Bolo cord, except this is brown. And we've got some wooden beads in the middle here. And then I attached them using more of the 1mm cord, this darker brown that's off of this variety card here. But if you didn't have this, you could potentially also do it the same way I'm about to show you and use, say, like a waxed thread or something like that in between, if you either didn't have this, or maybe you didn't have a needle that quite caught this. I like to use the leather, because that way it's kind of everything you see is leather except for the beads, and I just think it looks neat. But so with this one, you're going to want to start with 2 pieces of the Bolo cord. Just like my other one, I've cut mine at 9 inches because my final goal of length is 8.5. So that gives me a little bit of wiggle room, because remember, the clasp adds about 3/4 of an inch too. So if things shift, or, the ends don't end up quite even, I've got some trimming space in there. So I need the needle for this one again. And to attach these beads on here, I'm going to be using more of this 1mm cord. I'm going to use brown to sort of match this Bolo cord, and I'm going to squish the end of it just to get it through my needle. That really did help last time. Slide it on through, maybe. There we go. Okay. This is the one that really gets you used to, your technique of inserting stuff in through the loops of the Bolo cord. For this bracelet, you will find it easier, probably, if you flatten out the cord a bit before jumping in. And again, like how I did that, here's a piece that's curved, came right off the roll, which is fine. I mean, it curved like a bracelet, but it's a little easier just to see everything and have everything not trying to kind of get away from you when it's flat. So I found, in doing a little experimenting, the easiest thing was just to kind of curl it around the opposite direction, kind of like trying to flatten out a rolled up piece of paper. And if you just do that just a bit, it'll flatten out pretty good. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it just needs to, what you're doing is just kind of adjusting the pull of all these braided pieces of leather together. So it's got some, you don't have to yank on it, but if you just exert a little bit of pressure, it helps to even those out and make it so it can sit flat. So with this one, I want to start pretty near the end, because I want my beads to start fairly close to the clasp. Although again, you can't go right up on it, because it's going to make it harder to get it in there, because it'll be sort of pulling apart these pieces. If we think about it, they need to be like this to go in the clasp, so we can't have a bead right up against the end. But I'm assuming I'm going to be trimming off a little bit on the ends. So I'm going to have these 2 even, and I'm orienting them so that there's a line of the loops in this braided cord, just so it's running up right along the top. So I've got, this line It's kind of running along the top. It's not falling off the side. You know, it's not like this. I want it to be centered right there. And then I've got the other one, they're kind of matched up because I'm going to use the loops in order to measure between my beads. It makes it easier than having to measure. You're going to need to start at least, say I see like one partial loop that was cut off right here, and then 2, 3. You're going to want to go at least a few loops in from the end to start, because if you are too close to the end and you stick the needle through, it'll start unbraiding a little bit from the end, potentially. So you can trim that off, so it's fine. You can, you know, give it a little bit of room now. It'll make it easier. Again, oh, see, that one was really easy. It helps sometimes to kind of wiggle the needle to get it through. And I know I keep saying this, but I swear to you, it gets a lot easier after you do it a few times. There was a point at the very beginning of me figuring this out that I was like, maybe this isn't feasible, because occasionally I was having trouble getting the needle through, but you kind of fall into the angle and the amount of pressure that you're going to use. So I went just through one of these loops, and they slant, so it's going to slant, it doesn't matter. And I'm going to pick one on the other side that it's lined up with, go through there. Ooh, this stuff's being very cooperative. I want to leave probably a couple inches. Actually, for this one, you probably want to leave a slightly longer tail, just because it helps to get it around there at the end. And what I'm going to do is go around here. And then I went around once. I could go around twice. It's fine. But then I'm going to go around and then back through the loops that I just did, because I've looped around it once, so it's not going to pull out what I did. But I want to be able to pull this firm and make sure that this end of the cording is really staying together, so that it's going to be ready for that clasp. Pull through.
Annie, we have about 8 minutes left.
Yep. Okay. I think we can make it. All right. So now I'm going to just go to the next one right here. And how you want to space these is completely up to you, but this is just how I did it with mine. I'm going to go to the next one for putting in my first bead. Some of these loops, some of them are harder than others. Occasionally I would get one that I was having trouble getting through, and I would go through on the other side, push the needle through the other orientation, and then it would be a lot easier. Sometimes it's just the angle. So now I have kind of a little stitch right here. And then I'm going to pick up smaller bead. This particular collection of wooden beads comes in 3 strands of 3 different sizes. You've got smallest, middle, and then the largest. And I really like that, because then you could really mix and match with your sizes. You could have it going bigger toward the center or whatever you wanted. So I'm going to find this top loop on the opposite side that sits matched up with it, go through here. And then that bead can just nest right there, right in the middle between the bolo. So now the way I decided I wanted to space them is basically with one loop in the middle. So I'm coming out right here. So I'm going to go 1, 2. So the second one from there, oops. Depending on how clumsy you are, you may want a thimble for this. These needles are not pointed on the end, but occasionally, 99% of these loops, it just goes through like a dream. But then once in a while, there is just one, like this one. It's just waiting. There we go. You can see me stabbing myself. But that's why it's actually good to use these blend-headed needles. And then, just like with the other one, you may want to have pliers handy just to pull that through. You can pull it firm. Again, don't yank on it, because you will find that you could snap this thin cord if you yank very sharply. So I just put another bead on there. It's the middle-sized one. So now I'm going to count on the other side. 1, 2. Go through that loop. And doing it on these these top loops means that these sort of little stitches that you'll end up with, like there's one right there, they're kind of switch sides as you go down, can basically be on the bottom of the bracelet if you don't want them to be visible, so that, you know, on the top, it's just very seamless. This cord is hollow. Right, 1, 2. And I think there probably is a way to potentially to run your needle maybe in the middle of it. But I tried it and I had a little trouble with that. So I ended up deciding that this is the way I wanted to do it. But that could be something you could experiment with, because there is a sort of a hollow core to this. But essentially, you keep doing that. So you count down 1, 2, go through there, slide a bead on, 1, 2, through the next one, and you just keep going kind of back and forth, weaving down. I've got this guy that is basically done. And then when you get to your last bead, you need to finish it off kind of as it was started. Get my needle on here. Okay. And so I'm not going to go 2 now. I'm going to go to the next loop. Oops, actually, I'm on the wrong side. There we go. I'm right here. So I'm going to go to the next one down. Maybe. Pull it through. And then the same one on the other side. Oops. And you got to watch it. Sometimes it'll get looped around your cord in a way that you don't quite want. There we go. And then pull this firmly together. It may not connect completely. It depends kind of the size of your bead, but just have it go as close as possible. Wind this around once or twice. And then what we're actually going to do is kind of a knot, a lot like I did on the first bracelet, where I wound it around and then I'm going down through the middle and then up. I'm going to go around one more time to secure this. And then I want to go under here just so that I'm kind of securing this end so I can tighten it up. And you can do that on the first side if you want to. That's why it's good to leave a little extra, because you can actually come back and do it. I need to leave a little end. And on this side, I'll show you actually gluing in the clasp really quick, since we're getting on toward the end. And I'm going to cut. I'm going to leave about 1/4 of an inch here, or actually it's probably more like 1/2 inch. I think with this one, your total, you'll need to leave at least like 3/4 of an inch from the last bead on here. But if you don't want this knot to show very much, then make sure that you only have about 1/4 of an inch sticking out, because that's what's going to go into the clasp. And that way this will be right under it. So if I'm going to use this one, I like this one. I can choose whichever side I want. I want to make sure to turn over my bracelet, because I want my top of the bracelet to be the side without the stitches. And now I'm going to pick up my clasp, and with the super glue, it's a little hard to see in there, but I'm going to put enough in there of this gel super glue that I'm really covering the bottom of it. You don't want to put too much, but you don't want to put too little either. So I've kind of put just enough to cover the bottom, and I'm sorry about my dog, cover the bottom and make sure that there's enough in there that we're going to be able to get it glued in securely, but not have it glopping out the side. So now it's in there. And then, oh, I almost forgot. I need to flatten these a little bit, because again, they're a little bit too round to go in on their own. And then slot this over, push it in firmly. And if you have any excess glue coming off, you want to be kind of ready. I just did it with my fingers, but you'll probably want, you know, a paper towel or Q-tip or something to kind of dab that off quickly. But you push it down firmly and let it dry. And then you've got a very neat end to your bracelet. And again, make sure that when you orient it, when you put the second end in especially, that they're both curving down, so that, you know, they end up oriented correctly together. And the last thing that I want to show you is, here's a variation on this bracelet. It has kind of a different look, that the only difference is it's using black bolo cord instead of brown, and then it's got some metal beads. So you can see how many different ways that you could definitely do this pattern. And get the rest of them out. But I hope that this at least gives you some ideas on some projects and some types of things that you can do with leather cording. There are so many options out there. And like I said, small variations in some of these patterns can make kind of very distinctly different looking items. And I think they're great for gift giving because they do not take as long to make as they look like they do, which I think is the perfect handmade gift.
Thank you, Annie. They all look wonderful, and I wish everybody happy crafting.